too. Gratified though I was to find a pornographic pet supply store in Yang, or indeed anywhere, my business there was a slightly more elevated nature. I had come to see the famous Laming Flat Museum, which commemorates the town's days of glory as a gold mining outpost. It was too late to visit the museum that afternoon, but I presented myself at the front door at 9 the next morning only to find that the museum didn't open until 10. Never one to waste a living moment, I decided to repair to a town center cafe for breakfast and prepare myself with a little background reading. Thus, I was to be found 10 minutes later sitting in a mostly empty establishment on Young's main drag, drinking coffee, waiting for eggs and bacon, and delving through a hefty one-volume paperback history of Australia by the noted historian Manning Clark, which I had purchased a few days earlier in Sydney. The history of gold in Australia is a lively and generally heartwarming tale. It begins with a fellow named Edward Hargreaves, who in 1849 traveled from Sydney to the California goldfields, hoping to make his fortune. In 2 years of digging, he found nothing but dirt, but he did notice an uncanny similarity between the gold-bearing terrain of California and the land of New South Wales beyond the Blue Mountains, the countryside I had just been driving through. Hastening back to Australia before anyone else was struck by a similar thought, Hargreaves began to hunt in the creek beds around Orange and Bathurst, and very quickly found gold in payable quantities. Within a month of his discovery, 1,000 people were swarming through the district, turning over rocks and banging away with picks. Once they knew what to look for, they began to find gold everywhere. Australia was swimming in the stuff. An Aboriginal farm worker tripped over one lump that yielded almost 80 pounds of precious ore, an almost inconceivable amount to be found in one place. It was enough to ensure a life of princely splendor, or would have been except that as an Aborigine he wasn't allowed to keep it. The rock went instead to the property's owner. Scarcely had this rush gotten underway than gold was found in even more luscious quantities over the border in the newly created colony of Victoria. Australia became seized with a gold fever that made the California rush seem almost pale and indecisive. Cities and towns became visibly depopulated as workers left to seek their fortunes. Shops lost all their clerks. Policemen walked off their posts. Wives came home to find a note on the table and the wagon gone. Before the year was out, it was estimated that half the men in Victoria were digging for gold, and thousands more were pouring into the country from abroad. The gold rush transformed Australia's destiny. Before it, people could scarcely be induced to settle there. Now a stampede rose from every quarter of the globe. In less than a decade, a country took in 600,000 new faces, more than doubling its population. The bulk of that growth was in Victoria, where the richest goldfields were. Melbourne became larger than Sydney and for a time was probably the richest city in the world per head of population. But the real effect of gold was to put an end to transportation. When it was realized in London that transportation was seen as an opportunity rather than punishment, that convicts desired to be sent to Australia, the notion of keeping the country a prison became unsustainable. A few boatloads of convicts were sent to Western Australia until 1868. They would find gold there as well in equally gratifying quantities. But essentially, the gold rush of the 1850s marked the end of Australia as a concentration camp and its beginning as a nation. Despite all the wealth that was to be found, things weren't always so easy for the diggers, as they were known. In the hope of giving everyone a fair crack, prospectors were allowed to stake out only very modest claims, an area of just a few square yards, and here was where the problems began. When, in April 1860, gold was found at Lumping Flat, as Young was then known, fortune seekers turned up in quantity. By 1861, 22,000 people, among them 2,000 Chinese, were digging away, each on a plot of land about the size of a large throw rug. Inevitably, most weren't finding much. Many of the miners began to cast resentful glances at the Chinese, who seemed to bear the heat and privations more cheerfully than their European counterparts, and who cooperated in a way that was felt to give them an unfair advantage. Also, they seemed to be finding more gold. Also, they were Chinese. The upshot was the upshot is that the white diggers decided to go and beat up the Chinese. That would make things much better, surely. So, in the middle of 1861, a substantial minority of the white miners, somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 it appears, got together and staged a riot. It was a curiously organized affair. To begin with, the rioters brought in a brass band which played Rule Britannia and the Marseillaise, among other rousing tunes deemed suitable for a civil disturbance. They also made and carried a large banner, which has since become something of an icon in Australian history. So, as the band played the kind of tunes normally heard at a Sunday afternoon park concert, the miners moved through the Chinese area, beating people up with pickaxe handles or worse, robbing them and setting their tents alight. Then, just to make a day of it, they went on to burn down the courthouse. Afterward, 11 of the rioters were tried, but none were convicted. Obviously, not Australia's proudest moment. What was the immediate outcome of all this, I can't tell you. Manning Clark, who is, I just have to say this, a most exasperating historian, mentions that one European miner was killed in the fray, but gives no hint as to how many Chinese died or were injured. Nor does he say what became of them afterward, whether they were driven permanently from the site or whether things settled down and they returned to work. What is certain is that the Lemming Flat riot led to the adoption of what became known as the White Australia policy, which essentially forbade the immigration of any non-European people until the 1970s. It would, and I really don't mean a pun here, color nearly every aspect of Australian life for over a century. The Lumbing Flat Museum was a large, old, single-story brick building on a side street. I was there for the opening of the front door, an event that seemed to involve a great deal of unbolting and fiddling with a set keys by someone on the inside. I began to suspect that it wasn't quite as popular or important as institutions as I had supposed, for when the door swung open, the woman nearly jumped out of her skin. "Oh, you gave me such a start," she said, chuckling merrily as if I had played a waggish joke on her, which left me with the impression that visitors were perhaps somewhat occasional. Anyway, she seemed glad to have me, and after accepting my $3 Australian admission, urged me to take my time and come straight to her if I had any questions. The museum was quite large and filled with the most extraordinary collection of stuff. Flat irons, boot lasts, a buggy, old lanterns, old fragments of machinery. Except for the absence of cobwebs, I could have been in my grandfather's barn. In a corner of the main room, I found the centerpiece of the museum's collection, the large banner that the rioters carried in 1861. It is known as the roll-up flag because neatly embroidered across it were the words roll up, no Chinese." In his book, A Secret Country, which I had read before coming to Australia, the Australian journalist John Pilger suggests that the Lumbing Flat Museum rather glorifies the event and offers nothing in the way of contrition. If that was true when Pilger visited, his book was published in 1991, it no longer is. The labels gave a balanced and thoughtful account of the riots, though again with a curious blankness regarding casualty numbers on either side. The museum went on and seemed to contain everything that everyone in Young had ever acquired and no longer wanted. Sewing machines, adding machines, rifles, wedding albums, christening gowns. On a table was a large jar filled with small, shiny black spheres, thousands of them. I peered at it, trying to figure out what it was. "Canola seeds," said a voice quite near, so near it made me jump. I turned to find that lady who had let me in. "Oh, you made me jump," I said, and she smiled in a way that made me suspect that had been her intention. Perhaps it occurred to me that was how people passed the time in Young. "Are you finding everything?" she asked. I looked at her with interest. How would I know if I was or not? But I replied, "Yes, I am." Then added politely, "It's very interesting." "Yes, there's a lot of history in Young," she agreed, and looked around as if thinking perhaps there was too much. My gaze returned to the jar of seeds. "Do you grow a lot of canola around here?" I asked. "No," she said simply. I considered this and tried to think of something more to say. Well, you've got the seeds if you decide to start, I observed helpfully. Some people call it rape, she said, all but whispering the last word and raising her eyebrows significantly. Yes, I agreed in what I believe was a concerned tone. I prefer canola. Me too. I don't know why I said that. I have no position on seed names, however emotive, but it seemed prudent to agree with her. Merciful, just then a bell went, the kind of bell that sounds when someone comes in a shop entrance, and she excused herself. I waited half a dozen beats, then followed her out, for I had seen all I needed to and I wanted to get a move on. In the front hallway, a middle-aged couple was in the process of buying tickets. The space was confined and I had to wait for them to step aside to let me out, and I thanked the white-haired lady as I passed. You enjoyed it, did you? She asked. Very much, I lied. Here on holiday? Asked the lady customer, presumably picking up on my accent. Yes, I am, I lied again. How are you enjoying Australia? I love it. This was not a lie, but she looked at me doubtfully. Honestly, I added. Then a rather strange thing. Well, I thought it was strange. The female customer placed a hand on my forearm and said, with a touch of real anxiety, I hope everything is nice to you. I hope everyone is nice to you. I looked at her. Of course they will be, I said. Australians are always nice. She gave me a look of imploring earnestness. Do you really think so? Now, don't get me wrong. Australians are the most wonderful people, but when they grow introspective, it's sometimes a little strange. I nodded. Really, I said reassuringly. Australians are always nice. Of course they are, Maureen barked her husband. Salt of the earth. Now let the poor man go. I'm sure he has places he wants to be. He was clearly from the other, hardier school of Australian archetypes, the one that thinks that any bloke not lucky enough to be born in Australia is tragically ill-favored by fate and probably has a tiny dick as well. Poor bastard. And he was right, of course, about having places to be, I mean. It was time to move on to Canberra.